concluded. Questions without notice, the Leader of the Opposition.
Firstly, what I say, is there an announcement?
Sorry, the Leader of the House was just speaking with the Manager of Opposition Business. The Leader of the House is
just on indulgence.
Yes, on indulgence.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just advised as I came into the chamber that the Deputy Prime Minister is a possible close contact from a function and is just getting medical advice as we speak. So we'll make arrangements for those questions to be asked of another minister, but in the interim, perhaps we could just have a chat to the
Manager of Opposition Business. Yes, you have on indulgence.
I thank the Leader of the House for raising that at the outset. I'd simply ask if there are other ministers or members of the House who were at the same event. It would be very helpful if they self-identified rather than I don't know if there were. I've been told there were. That might be wrong. But it will have implications for all of us.
And does the Leader of the House want to say something on behalf of the House?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I'm advised, the Deputy Prime Minister is the only person that's in that scenario at the moment. We'll make further inquiries, but just in terms of ministerial arrangements, the member for Bradford will answer questions on behalf of the Deputy Prime Minister, and that's the arrangement that's in place.
Okay, and obviously in the capacity as Speaker, I can concur with the remarks that have been said just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, with the remarks, and again, there have been members on both sides. I remind members that the Sergeant-at-Arms has sent out regular memorandums about the responsibilities that all of us have, and to keep up with all of the updates that are there and take the actions that are required. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. On that basis, a different question perhaps. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. The New South Wales COVID outbreak has grown to nearly 40 cases. There is community transmission of highly infectious COVID variants in 3 states. The New South Wales Premier says until the vast majority of our population is vaccinated, these threats will be real and ongoing. When will the Prime Minister do his 2 jobs, fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national quarantine system?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in New South Wales is, of course, concerning to all members. I've been in touch again with the New South Wales Premier today, and I commend the New South Wales Premier and the New South Wales Government on the steps they are taking to address the community outbreak that has occurred there, which is still not at levels like we see overseas, but a very attentive government with the best contact tracing system, I would say, Mr. Speaker, of any jurisdiction, certainly in Australia, and I'd go further beyond that to anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker. So I have great confidence in the New South Wales health officials to do the job that is needed now, as they've moved very quickly, not just on the testing that is being undertaken, but also the tracing down of those contacts within those 24-hour periods, which is so vital to contain these outbreaks. Now, Mr. Speaker, the COVID pandemic has not gone anywhere. All Australians understand that, and when you've had some 370,000 Australians and others coming to Australia over the period of the pandemic, there have been a small number, around 20 or so, Mr. Speaker, of breaches that have occurred within a system that has otherwise been successful in preventing 99.99% of any transmission out of that more than 370,000 arrivals into the country. Now, Mr. Speaker, the vaccination program today, as we sit here, as I sit here, as members of the House sit where you are sitting in the chamber today, will be 7 million doses that will have been administered. 2/3 and more, Mr. Speaker, of the population over 70 who have received their first dose. Half of the population over the age of 50 has received their first dose. More than a quarter of the population aged over 16 have received that first dose. The number of Pfizer vaccine doses available will increase significantly in July and again in September and October, as has been outlined by General Fruin, who has oversight control of the vaccination program. And so, Mr Speaker, as is always the case, as has occurred in Melbourne and as has occurred in other parts of the country, when these outbreaks do occur, and we have always indicated that that is always a risk, Mr Speaker, then our health officials will respond, our health workers respond, and we will get through this challenge just as we have so many others over the course of this pandemic. But the fact remains, Mr Speaker, the two jobs of this government: save lives, save livelihoods. If it were not for the actions of our government, together with the governments around Australia, Mr Speaker, more than 30,000 additional Australians would have lost their lives to COVID. And in addition to that, Mr Speaker, we would not have more people in work today than there was before the COVID pandemic began. Saving lives, saving livelihoods, that's what this government is achieving, Mr Speaker, together with other governments around the country. Australians understand that, Mr Speaker, and will continue to do the job.
Members on my left. Just before we call the next question, just before I call the Deputy Prime Minister, members on my left will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House outlined the situation and the circumstances, and the Deputy Prime Minister— Yep. OK. We'll go to the next question.
Minister.
Member for REID, sorry. Member for REID has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy. Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting Australians in uncertain times by delivering on our economic recovery plan, including passing crucial legislation that will create jobs and keep Australians safe?
What a question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for REID for her question, together all Sydney-Sider members of this chamber. These are uncertain times, particularly in Sydney, and we are very mindful of our fellow Sydney-Siders as they face this most recent challenge. And again, I commend the New South Wales government for the actions, the common-sense actions that they're taking, Mr Speaker, to track down and trace down this latest outbreak that has occurred. But, Mr Speaker, as a government, we are getting on with the job of securing the recovery and taking Australia through the course of this global pandemic, saving lives and saving livelihoods. And over the course of this last fortnight, Mr Speaker, as the House and Senate have met here in Canberra, and indeed as I've had the opportunity to be overseas the previous week and participating in the G7, we are getting on with that job. And that job has seen us rally our defence partners and allies around the world and to alert them strongly to the situation and secure their partnership in addressing the many security challenges we face here in the Indo-Pacific. We have seen, Mr Speaker, legislation passed through the Your Future, Your Super Bill, which has seen $17.9 billion over 10 years being able to be saved by Australians when it comes to their fees that they might otherwise have incurred as a result of their superannuation investments. Guaranteeing international support, garnering that international support in the fight we're taking up, Mr Speaker, in the latest challenges against what is the best managed reef in the world, Mr Speaker, the Great Barrier Reef, securing that much-needed international support for our case at UNESCO. A mutual recognition of skills has passed the Parliament, Mr Speaker, which will cut red tape, providing some $2.4 billion boost to our economy, making sure that tradespeople and others can move between state borders and do the work, Mr Speaker, without being held back by red tape and additional costs. Stronger powers to protect Australians online from trolls and bullies have been passed by this Parliament, Mr Speaker. Important protections keeping Australians safe, and I particularly commend Erin Molan for her advocacy and the Minister for Communications, Mr Speaker, who's done a great job in bringing that bill to this Parliament and shepherding it through to make it law. Stronger protections also against serious organised crime on our borders, Mr Speaker. I commend the Minister for Home Affairs. This is toughening up to ensure that those organised criminal gangs cannot get access to our airports and to our ports. And, Mr Speaker, there was opposition to this bill, but thankfully, Mr Speaker, we were able to get that bill passed through the Parliament and ensure that the Parliament saw common sense. The fuel security bills have been passed, Mr Speaker, supporting particularly our agricultural sector. And after a very long wait, the National Radioactive Waste Facility Bill has passed, Mr Speaker, and this is a major achievement for the government to ensure that we are putting in place the recovery plan from the pandemic.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. A driver of international aircrew who was reportedly unvaccinated and unmasked is at the centre of the New South Wales outbreak. The government's hand-picked advisor, Jane Holton, says she warned the government last year that transport arrangements were, quote, a potential hole and had to be a high priority. Why did the Prime Minister ignore that advice, and does he now take any responsibility for the Sydney outbreak?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, as the member would be well aware, the vaccination of those workers in quarantine is the responsibility of state governments. And what we're seeing
Members
again from the opposition, Mr Speaker, is a deliberate attempt to try and politicise this terrible outbreak in Sydney.
Members on my left.
As a Sydney-sider, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to have the Labor Party add to the hardship faced by Sydney-siders by seeking to politicise what they're having to go through now. There are responsibilities that are held at a Commonwealth level and at a state level, Mr Speaker. And as the Premier has said this morning in New South Wales, the investigation into that transport worker who should have been vaccinated, the doses were available, Mr Speaker, and in this case that worker was not vaccinated, and the New South Wales Premier has made it very clear that they're investigating into how that occurred. So, Mr Speaker, I would encourage the opposition, rather than to seek political point scoring in the middle of a pandemic, to grow up, Mr Speaker, and focus on supporting the government as we seek to take Australia through this pandemic. Australians do not need the bickering from the opposition, Mr Speaker. They need a constructive opposition which will support the government as we continue to lead Australia through this crisis.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the work the Morrison-Joyce government is taking to protect the lives and livelihoods of regional Australians?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the member for Dawson for his question and note the splendid work that he has done in so many things, such as the Mackay Ring Road, and also how he has been a great champion for the farmers. For farmers, especially the cane farmers.
Member for Isaacs.
And we want to make sure, I'm doing everything I can to make sure the member for Dawson remains the member of Dawson after the next election because of the advocacy that he has done. Now, the member for Dawson asks the question about the update of the House on the work of the Morrison-Joyce government. The ultimate goal of any process, especially in dealing with COVID, is to make sure that we get the vaccination out. But the purpose of getting the vaccination out is to make sure that people don't die. That is the ultimate goal. And that ultimate goal in our nation has been exceptional. We have had no deaths through community contact this year. We've had one tragic death from a person who's come in from overseas. Now, that is not the case in other parts of the world. We've had 2 million deaths overseas. Each one of those 2 million as tragic as the other. The purpose that we have taken in this nation, at both the Commonwealth level and at a state level, is to work on policy commitments that keep the Australian people safe, and a process of keeping them safe. And I'd have to say that Australia has been more successful this year than any other nation on earth because we have had no community deaths. And that is the ultimate test. And when you look at it, you can go to our regional towns. If you go to the regional town of Wagga, they've had no deaths this year. And I don't know even whether they've got a case in Wagga at the moment. If you go to Shepparton, they've had no deaths this year. I don't even know whether they've got a case in Shepparton. If you go to Gladstone, they've had no deaths this year. I don't even know whether they've got a case in Gladstone. We have no cases in Tamworth. We've had no deaths this year. And that is the ultimate success, the ultimate test of success of the government, that the Prime Minister, that myself, that each member of this parliament can go back to their communities and say that the Australian people have been kept safe. They've been kept safe through the diligent actions of the Commonwealth and assisted by the states in making sure that we keep the Australian people in a place that makes us the envy of the world. As I conclude, the final judgment on anything The rollout is so vitally important, but there is one thing more important than that, that we have kept Australians alive.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. The arrival of international air crews into Australia and quarantine are clearly the Commonwealth's responsibility. The Prime Minister ignored Jane Holton's warnings both on national quarantine and on transport arrangements for international air crew. Why won't the Prime Minister take responsibility for his failures? Or is this yet another case of it all being someone else's fault?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I just simply reject the assertions that are just put out there by the member who has put this question, Mr Speaker. As Australians understand and as states and territories understand, the vaccination of those who were involved in the quarantine process, which was put in place by a decision of National Cabinet in March of last year, Mr Speaker, is administered by those states and territories. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party can seek to point score all they like, but what Australians know is there is not one, as to the best of my knowledge, not one person right now who is in an ICU in an Australian hospital as a result of falling victim to COVID. What I also know, Mr Speaker, is you look around the world, that is not the case. If you look in the United Kingdom, and the most recent information I have, Mr Speaker, is over 16,000 new cases in one day. Some 250 almost people are in hospital, and there are almost 20 deaths. That's just in one day, Mr Speaker. And for the Labor Party to come in here, into this chamber, day after day, and talk down the achievements of the Australian people and how Australia has been able to come through this pandemic to this point in such a situation where Australians are not falling victim fatally to this COVID virus, where Australians, almost 1 million jobs having come back into the economy, Mr Speaker, after the pandemic hit. And so we have more people in work today than there were before the pandemic started. Mr Speaker, this is a great achievement of the Australian people. And all we get from the Labor Party day after day is snarling negative.
For a second. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, I'm sure this could be relevant to a Dixer if he got someone to ask him, but it's not relevant to the question he's been asked.
The Prime Minister, I think, has been relevant up until quite recently. The problem with the question that allows him some latitude is the very last line about always being someone else's fault. But I do say to the Prime Minister, in the time remaining, if he can bring himself back to the question, I think he's had some ample opportunity, and quite rightly, to respond on the generalities. Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll conclude on this note. The point of order just taken by the Manager of Opposition Business really exposes the Labor Party. The fact that Australian lives aren't being lost and Australians are in jobs is exactly relevant, Mr Speaker. That's what Australians are interested. If the Labor Party don't think that's relevant to managing the pandemic, then they betray their snarling negativity that they parade in this parliament each and every day.
Members on my left, the member for Warringah has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, the advice I have received that the most effective way to stop spread of the virus is to first vaccinate the most vulnerable and second the most active spreaders, being the 20 to 39-year-olds in our community. Yet this age group does not even have access to the vaccine in New South Wales. Can you confirm that New South Wales has sufficient Pfizer capacity to immediately vaccinate this cohort?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'll ask the Minister for Health and Aged Care to add to my answer. The assertion made by the member regarding the cohort she's referred to as being a priority vaccination cohort is not the advice of the SciTag advisory panel led by Professor Murphy. It is not the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. The priority cohorts, groups of people, was set out in the National Vaccination Strategy, which went through National Cabinet, went through our own Cabinet, Mr Speaker, last year, and those priorities were set by the medical professionals advising the Commonwealth, but not just those medical advisors, Mr Speaker, but also the chief health officers of all the states and territories. And so we have been following that medical advice, and that is what has driven that strategy, Mr Speaker. And so it is today that the more vulnerable populations, those in residential aged care, 100% of residential aged care facilities, Mr Speaker, have had that first dose offered, and 99% have had the second dose offered, and that will soon be completed with both doses. The population aged over 70, also then the most vulnerable population, has a vaccination of more than two-thirds.
Prime Minister, we'll just pause for a second. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Just relevance, Mr Speaker. The question did go to supply of Pfizer.
Yes, okay, but it also had a preamble, and if it had been just that question, I think, as I've pointed out many times, I think the member would have a stronger case, but I'll keep listening to the Prime Minister to ensure he's being relevant. He had indicated he was going to ask the Minister for Health to add to his answer as well. So I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I will ask the Minister of Health to join this answer just in a second. But the point that is made by the member is that we should be vaccinating 20 to 40-year-olds as a priority cohort, Mr Speaker, with the Pfizer vaccine. That is not the advice of the Chief Medical Officer or the government's medical advisors, and so I contest what she is putting forward to this chamber. But the Pfizer supplies, I will ask the Minister for Health to update the House.
The Minister for Health has the call.
Sorry, mate.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. To add to the Prime Minister's answer, I can indicate that this week New South Wales is expected to receive another 134,000 Pfizer vaccinations over the course of the coming days. In addition to that, over the period from July to August, during the course of the next month, that will grow on average to over 200,000 Pfizer doses per week, and that will be over 104,000 for the state government, and it will average over the course of that period over 102,000 for general practices. That will then grow during the September period to over 290,000 Pfizer and over 30,000 Moderna, and then in the final quarter of the year, 540,000 a week and 149,000 Moderna. As the Prime Minister said, the advice received from ATAGI, from SciTag, from the Chief Medical Officer and the previous Chief Medical Officer, and from around the world has always been that we start with the oldest and we work our way through, because vaccination will give the greatest protection to those people.
Time has concluded. The member for Swan.
Treasurer, I'll start it again. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House why the Morrison government's recent budget was so important in protecting Australian jobs and livelihoods during this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Swan for his question, acknowledge his experience as a Sparky, Mr Speaker, and his experience for 30 years in small business, in an air conditioning business, Mr Speaker, importing and exporting. And more than 20,000 small and medium-sized businesses in his electorate are getting access to the immediate expensing provisions that we announced in this year's budget. Now, the outbreak in New South Wales is another reminder that the pandemic is with us. And despite Australia's success in suppressing the virus compared to many other countries around the world, and our success in undergoing a very significant economic recovery, the outbreak in New South Wales is a reminder that the pandemic is not over. And this was the backdrop for the recent budget, a budget where we announced an additional $41 billion in direct COVID-related support, extending the low and middle income tax offset for another year, providing more than 10 million Australians with tax relief, Mr Speaker, rewarding hard-working Australians, encouraging aspiration and putting more money back into their pocket, and extending the immediate expensing provisions for another year, Mr Speaker, including the loss carryback measure, which will cover around 320 billion of investment. And we're seeing the results of those programs, including machinery and equipment investment having its strongest numbers in nearly 18 years in the recent national accounts. And we also in the budget continue to invest in our 10-year, $110 billion infrastructure pipeline. And I congratulate the member for Riverina for the strong work that he did in this regard. And our skills programs, 163,000 new places in the Job Trainer program, $2.7 billion for 170,000 apprentices, like the Sparky, the member for Swan, Mr Speaker, who are getting support to continue to take the jobs available across the economy. Our investment in childcare, putting a particular focus on those who have got more than one child in childcare, with Treasury estimate that nearly 300,000 additional hours a week of work will be created by this particular program. Now I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that those
Members on my left
will not only spend more, that they will tax more, Mr Speaker. And they took to the last election $387 billion of higher taxes. And Paul Keating, Mr Speaker, someone that those opposite like to look up to, said, I think that if you're talking about the Labor Party and why it lost the election, it failed to understand the middle-class economy. So truer words have never have been said.
Just before I'm going to call the Deputy Prime Minister on indulgence, look, I just want to address the chamber very briefly. The Leader of the House made a statement as to why the Deputy Prime Minister wasn't here at the start of question time, and in that statement he said the Deputy Prime Minister was getting health advice. So self-evidently he's got that advice which enables him to be here, but I'll just invite him on indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And with indulgence, shortly before question time, I was alerted that I may have been in contact with a person who was a close contact with the case. I immediately sought further information and advice from Deputy Chief Medical Officer Professor Michael Kidd. As I am not a close contact, I'm now able to attend the chamber.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the government tabled a new vaccine rollout document that does not include a single target and instead refers to horizons. The government has not met a single one of its vaccine targets and the rollout is months behind. Is that why the government has now given up on vaccine targets and is talking about horizons? Does the Prime Minister accept that horizons are something that you never reach?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the rollout of the vaccination program is a very serious undertaking, and Lieutenant General Fruin is leading that undertaking. And the mocking tone used by the Leader of the Opposition does him no credit, Mr Speaker.
Members
and
on
it
my
betrays
left.
that all of this is just a political game to him. A political game. He comes here seeking to score points on issues of great seriousness for the Australian people, Mr Speaker. He may choose to take offence at that, but he may want to check his own.
The Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order. We're not even 30 seconds in, but he has a right to take a point of order on relevance, which I presume it is.
I do absolutely, Mr Speaker. This is a serious question about a change in definition away from targets to horizons, which the government has announced.
No, the Leader of the Opposition won't debate the matter.
Not just sledge.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Australian people would have been able to see very clearly the tone adopted by the Leader of the Opposition when he presented that question. It was there for all to see, Mr Speaker. And so Operation COVID Shield, which is being led by Lieutenant General Fruin, someone of great character and ability, that we've put in charge of this task, Mr Speaker, to set out what the goals are, indeed, and as well as the release of doses of the vaccine over the course of the 3 periods that take us between now and the end of year is important information to inform the activities of the states, as well as to inform the partners in the vaccination program, in particular our general practitioners. So as we continue to build up the number of general practitioners that are involved, they need that understanding of what the flow of vaccine is going to be based on the supply that we understand to be the case based on our contract arrangements and the information we're getting from our suppliers. So, Mr Speaker, he may wish to mock the language that is being used by Lieutenant General Fruin, but Lieutenant General Fruin is a person of great standing and integrity, Mr
Prime Minister
Speaker.
will
I have confidence in him.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On a point of order, I appreciate the Prime Minister can lose his temper even behind the screen, but this is ridiculous,
Business,
just absurd.
The Leader of the House.
What is the point of order, other than to come up here and make a statement, a political statement, to back up
members on
the emotional contribution of the Leader of the Opposition?
I'm just going to make a quick comment. Caution those interjecting. I've already cautioned the member for Isaacs a couple of times, and I haven't changed my attitude. I'm just going to say, when a question has an element of irony in it, it can be ruled out of order. In the interests of free-flowing debate, I have allowed that, and certainly the last part of that question did. If I'm going to allow that, really you are going to get a response. If members really feel strongly about that, I would have to curtail the way questions are being asked. I don't want to do that because we have a very open question time. So the Prime Minister, I think, has been in order. He's certainly on the policy topic, and I'm going to keep listening to him. And if I think he's straying away, of course I will pull him up. But a very short, sharp question really narrows the capacity of a minister, in this case the Prime Minister, to answer it with adding lots of material. Something that has an element of irony to it does mean it is a political statement that can be, I think, responded to within reason. I'll stress within reason, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So the horizon projections that the Leader of the Opposition mockingly referred to, Mr Speaker, were actually put together by Lieutenant General Fruin in command of the operation he is leading on the vaccination Operation COVID Shield, Mr Speaker. Those horizon projections were laid out to the National Cabinet earlier this week, on Monday, when I convened that meeting. I can assure Australians and those in the chamber that when Lieutenant General Fruin was outlining those horizon projections, Mr Speaker, it was not met with the mocking tone that we've just heard from the Leader of the Opposition. So I would invite the Leader of the Opposition to support the operation being left by Lieutenant General Fruin and try and refrain from his usually snarky responses.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is continuing to protect Australians from the global COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for North Sydney and particularly acknowledge his role in ensuring that as many people as possible come forward for vaccination in his electorate, as I'm sure that everybody in this chamber is doing, encouraging those within their electorates to take the opportunity to step forward. One of the critical things is that in keeping Australians safe, we look at the circumstances around the world. In the last 24 hours now, 429,000 cases, over 9,600 lives lost, and that brings it this year to almost 2.1 million lives lost around the world, a figure which it represents nearly half the population of our two great cities. And that's the official figure. And as the World Health Organization has indicated, the reality is far, far greater. In Australia, our #1 goal has been to save lives and to protect lives. This year, we have had no lives lost in this country to anybody who has caught COVID in Australia. That comparison with the rest of the world is staggering. But equally, as the Prime Minister mentioned earlier, on the advice that we have from the National Incident Centre shortly before joining you, no Australian at this point in time is in ICU even with COVID. Now, every case is a risk. Every case is a challenge. But in a staggering global pandemic of almost 97 million cases and 2.1 million lives lost this year, to have no Australian who has lost their lives having caught COVID here, to have no Australian who's in ICU at this point in time, whilst every day we watch, is the real measure of our national success. Having said that, what we are also seeing is the vaccination rollout, and we're seeing now today the 7th million Australian, or the 7th million vaccination in Australia. We have 27.7% of Australians, as of last night, 16 years of age and over, who've been vaccinated. We have approximately 50% of over 50s, and very significantly, we now have over 2/3 of the over 70s who've been vaccinated, as well as 100% of aged care facilities that have had vaccinations around Australia. And so these elements are fundamental in saving lives and protecting lives, along with protecting the borders, the testing and the tracing and the distancing. All of these things have come together to protect Australia, to protect Australians, and to put Australia in the position where, in a world of 2.1 million lives lost, at this moment no Australian this year has caught COVID and lost their lives in Australia, and for that we are deeply thankful.
The member for Cooper.
Thank you, Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Australians in aged care and disability care were meant to be vaccinated by Easter so they would be protected by the start of winter. But according to the government's Vaccination Horizons document, vaccinations of these most vulnerable Australians will not be completed until the end of winter. Isn't this an admission of abject failure by this government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Health and Aged Care to respond.
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the Prime Minister. As I mentioned, 100% of residential aged care facilities around Australia have received first doses, and 99.1% of facilities have received second doses as we look around Australia. In particular, with regards to residents, we encourage all families to provide consent to those members of their families who are within aged care facilities, and as part of that, one of the things we're doing, and this in particular goes to the member for Cooper's point, whilst we have made sure that first and second doses are available around the country, 100% of facilities, 99.1% for second doses, with the remaining ones to be completed over the course of the coming days, we are continuing to ensure that every person has access, that if they do change their mind, if their circumstances have changed, that's why we've done a number of things. We've ensured that there's ongoing work in the aged care facilities in terms of InReach, the InReach clinics which have been occurring around the country. In addition to that, we have also created a new item for GPs, an in-home visitation fee of $56.75. That means that they have an additional support over and above the payment for the vaccinations themselves to attend facilities, whether that's a private home for an elderly resident who is unable to move and to go to a vaccination clinic in one way, shape or form, whether it's a disability home or whether it's an aged care facility. In addition to that, and this relates to a question asked by the member for Hindmarsh, last week we have also contracted providers such as TLC who have vaccinated their own residents and their own staff to offer such services to other clinics. And then there is a fourth element in terms of InReach, where many facilities are choosing to provide continuous vaccination for those residents who were unable or unwilling to take up vaccination during the first round.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's steadfast commitment to the Great Barrier Reef, the best managed reef in the world?
Members on my left, the Minister for the Environment has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to take this question from the member for Higgins about the Great Barrier Reef. It's an iconic, deeply loved World Heritage Site, 2,300 kilometres long, 400,000 square kilometres of catchment, managed by our farmers, 900 islands, many of them being restored and rehabilitated. Spectacular, iconic and deeply loved. It's very interesting that when the Great Barrier Reef is raised, the Labor Party laughs. And I don't know whether they might be covering something up here, Mr Speaker, because what they might need is a history lesson. The reef was first foreshadowed for in-danger listing under Labor in 2012, and it took a coalition government and a Liberal Party minister to get on the front foot to invest with Queensland Labor $3 billion for the Reef 2050 plan. And absolutely everything that Labor has responded to us in this latest iteration of listing of the Great Barrier Reef has failed to recognise and respond that Team Australia should be backing our reef. And I call on the Labor Party to be part of that. And, Mr Speaker, I have expressed concerns about the flawed process leading up to the next World Heritage Committee meeting, and I'm not the only one. Overnight, 12 UNESCO ambassadors wrote, unusual for this to happen, wrote to the Director-General of UNESCO, similarly expressing concerns about the process for consultation leading up to this 44th World Heritage meeting. That included the UK, it included France, it included Canada. So these concerns are valid and they need to be recognised. And the response to them from us is to say we've always worked well within the World Heritage Committee system. We want to continue to do that. We've worked to build the Reef 2050 plan. I was in the electorate of the member for Flynn not that long ago, launching the Reef Resilience Vessel, just a further $6 million under the Joint Field Management Program, to have those eyes on the water, protecting this iconic place, to respond to the needs of recreational fishers, to farmers, to citizen science, to the scientists that work to develop heat-resistant corals so that coral seeding can take place year-round, to the international collaborations that we have. But I'm coming back to this point because the jeer and smear from Labor should not be on this topic. What the Labor Party should be doing is what they did before.
I'll get the minister to pause for a second. This was a very tight question that didn't mention the Labor Party because it can't, or alternative policies. It was about the government's commitment and no one else's at all, so she needs to confine herself to what the government's doing.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the communities, to the farmers, to the fishers, to the scientists, to those who live up and down the reef catchments, the Morrison government is standing up for the reef, proud of the work we've done, proud of the investment we've made and standing ready to fight for the reef.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Department of Industry has said mRNA vaccines might not be produced in Australia until 4 years from now. Premiers have said the vaccine rollout is urgent. Is the government really saying it might be 4 years before an mRNA vaccine is produced in Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Industry to add to this answer. This time last year, Mr Speaker, the prospect of there even being an mRNA vaccine was very remote. And in the course of a very short period of time, the world has responded technologically through medical science, Mr Speaker, to the COVID-19 pandemic in a way that has been absolutely unprecedented. And the IP around the production of mRNA vaccines, which were of themselves very remote prospects when it came to the production of vaccines, have proved to be enormously successful. And the government is taking steps to establish mRNA vaccine production capabilities in Australia, like many countries will be seeking to do. but the ability to manufacture those vaccines currently is limited to only a few countries. And as a result, we know that mRNA vaccines will be an important part of vaccines more broadly in the future. So it's not just about the pandemic, Mr Speaker. The capability we're seeking to establish will create a capability for Australia for the long term. And so I'll ask the Minister to add further to the answer.
And I'll give the call to the Minister for Industry.
I thank the member for the question and the Prime Minister for the referral of the question. And the question's in very similar terms to a question that was asked, I think, last week. But the answer is, in essence, that there are some time frames. There's an inside time range that has been put in the media on a number of occasions, which puts the potential of a scale-up manufacture of an mRNA vaccine at a 3 to 6 month time frame. There's an outside time frame, which was noted by departmental officers at 3 to 4 years. The best estimates, I think, are in the middle of those two time ranges. I would say that those middle time ranges are the more likely. But I think to get some sense of the complications in all of this, you could have a look at the efforts that are being made inside Victoria with the Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences to manufacture doses of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine for trials. And that's being done with monies that have been allocated by the Victorian government and also monies that were allocated by the Commonwealth government. And they've noted that there are 150 people that will be involved in clinical trials that are due to begin in October, with preliminary results expected to be available in the first half of 2022. So the two great pieces of the jigsaw puzzle here are, of course, the IP, which Pfizer clearly has, which is a very valuable piece of intellectual property at the moment. We would very much hope that that IP could be duplicated in Australia, and all power to Monash and the MIPS vaccine trials that are going on, but that's a very complicated process. Manufacturing at scale is the other part of that jigsaw puzzle. The reason why we've gone through this in a cautious and careful way is because those two things in combination are what we need for a longevitous 10-year program, and we're doing that carefully and cautiously, but it will be successful.
Time has concluded. The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on the Morrison government's technology, not taxes approach to reducing emissions, and is the minister aware of any alternative views?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for the question. And can I pay tribute to her very strong advocacy for clean energy technologies and, of course, the role that technologies like hydrogen can play in northern Tasmania. We were lucky enough to visit recently the Bell Bay aluminium smelter and Liberty Australia there in the members' electorate, and we see great opportunity there for hydrogen, Mr Speaker. But on this side of the House, she knows, and we all know, that there are two ways to reduce emissions, and there's only one way, Mr Speaker, that delivers a stronger economy for Australia. And that's through technology, Mr Speaker, through innovation, through Australian ingenuity, Mr Speaker. And that's why we shouldn't be restricting organisations like ARENA. We should be expanding their remit because they are great Australian ingenuity, Mr Speaker. Now, whilst others in this place are happy to talk down Australia, we on this side know that our track record on emissions reduction is something we can be proud of. We're 20% down, more than 20% down in our emissions reduction since 2005, lowest level of emissions since 1990. Emissions lower now than at any time under the Labor government. Record levels of investment in household solar, Mr Speaker, and we're on track to meet and beat our 2030 target, just as we met and beat our 2020 targets, Mr Speaker. But I am asked about alternatives, and we've seen this week, Mr Speaker, Labor teaming up with the Greens to oppose expanding ARENA's mandate, Mr Speaker, something that industry leaders have labelled as short-sighted, Mr Speaker, and a blow for cleaner
and the Minister
energy.
for Agriculture.
They opposed it, Mr Speaker. Now, we know on this side, as I said, if it's not to be technology, it is to be taxes, Mr Speaker. And the member for McMahon, the Shadow Minister, has never seen a tax he didn't like, Mr Speaker, never seen a tax he didn't like. When they were last in government, of course, they imposed a carbon tax, and when the member for McMahon was Treasurer, Mr Speaker, he raised the carbon tax, and of course he took carbon tax policies to the last election. Now, Mr Speaker, when the member for McMahon was asked this week whether he opposed carbon taxes been imposed on Australian exporters, Australian miners and farmers. He refused to condemn it, Mr Speaker. He refused to condemn a carbon tax being imposed on Australian exporters and farmers, Mr Speaker. If the member for McMahon can't impose a carbon tax himself, he will encourage others to do it, Mr Speaker. He'll encourage others to do it, Mr Speaker. We know on this side of the place to get emissions down, it's about Australian ingenuity, technology and getting on with the job.
The member for Oxley.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Queensland Premier confirmed the 25th COVID outbreak from hotel quarantine and called on the Morrison-Joyce government to establish a regional quarantine facility. Does the Deputy Prime Minister support a purpose-built quarantine facility in regional Queensland which would provide regional jobs, boost the regional economy and keep Australians safe from COVID?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And at the start, I'd just like to table a statement pertinent to what I've said before. Take leave. Do I need leave to say that?
Yes, you don't need leave.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, obviously, the National Cabinet working together is doing everything within its power to make sure that we achieve the outcome that we want. That is, no one dies of COVID, and we have been remarkably successful in that process. And you brought up Queensland and why it's pertinent there, but we are so proud of the fact that in Cape York it is a COVID-free regional area, that in Emerald is a COVID-free regional area, that Theodore is a COVID-free regional area, that Roma is a COVID-free regional area, that Miles is a COVID-free regional area, my old hometown of St George is a COVID-free regional area. If we go up to the member for Leichhardt's area, Innisfail is a COVID-free regional area.
I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, if he could just resume his seat for a second. Everyone's entitled to a preamble. I've made that clear in answers, but we're more than a minute in, and the Deputy Prime Minister will need to now bring himself to the substance of the question, or wind up his answer.
Thank you very much. And to go to the substance of the question, I'd like to refer to the Minister.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Practice makes clear that the Prime Minister can refer answers to other ministers. There is no precedent for ministers referring answers to other ministers.
Yeah, I actually have been reflecting on this. I'll now need to find the page for you. Okay, well, the Deputy Prime Minister can have. Then I'll address the matter.
So, well, it's a shame, but no doubt he would have gone to the point that regional facilities can only be approved if they believe they have a tertiary medical facility proximate to it, and that is the decision. That is the decision. That is the decision of the National Cabinet, and that is why we don't have regional processing facilities.
Just for the members on my left, just if the member for Flynn can be his normal patient self for a second. I will just address that matter because certainly that's been the convention and that's normally what's happened, but the practice does state a minister, and I'll just try and paraphrase, minister may refuse to answer a question. He or she may also transfer a question to another minister, and it's not in order to question the reasons for doing so. Yeah, and I think the Manager of Opposition Business is making a reasonable point. I think the convention will show that they don't do it halfway through. That's something the Prime Minister does. So you could transfer it at the start, but the practice of adding to the Prime Minister's answer, I think, is one we want to maintain. Yes, the Manager of Opposition.
Transferred at the start. It's only on the basis that the question's been asked of the wrong minister.
No. I'll come back to that. Might as well deal with this. Just hang on one tick. Just give me one tick. What we'll do is... We might as well deal with this now, quickly. It can happen if it's addressed to an incorrect minister. That's true, but it also says if a question's been addressed to an incorrect minister, the responsible minister may answer, but the member's been given an opportunity. It also does say in many instances the responsibility referred to in a question may be shared by 2 or more ministers, and it is only the ministers concerned who are in a position to determine authoritatively which of them is the more responsible. That's certainly the case, but I think if it covers more than one policy area, it could be transferred at the start. I think that's an acceptable way to go. Okay. The ever-patient member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the minister update the House of the Morrison-Joyce government's plans to cut red tape and green tape in the resource sector, creating jobs and supporting regional communities?
The minister has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for Flynn for his question, Mr Speaker? And the member for Flynn understands just how important it is that we do cut bureaucratic red tape and green tape processes. Now, the member for Flynn, I mean, Mr Speaker, he's been a fuel distributor, he's been a publican, a racehorse owner, he might even still be a racehorse owner, I'm not too sure. But he absolutely gets why it's important that we do streamline these processes. Now, Mr Speaker, we have legislation before the parliament. We are looking to ensure that we can streamline particularly those environmental processes which are in place right now. Now, why does it matter, Mr Speaker? Why does it matter? Well, here's why it matters. There is a press release which has just gone out from Bravis, formerly known as Adani, Mr Speaker. You might have heard of them. And what does it say? It says, "We have struck coal at Carmichael." The Adani mine has struck coal at Carmichael in central Queensland. And what have they said? Well, it was an exciting day, Mr Speaker, for the 2,600 people on the project. It delivers jobs, and it has been in the making for over a decade. 10 years to deliver a project which has delivered jobs to central Queensland, which has delivered strength to the local economy. And in the member for Flynn's area, the member for Dawson's area, the member for Capricornia, the member for Herbert, there are jobs for their constituents, Mr Speaker. Now, if we are serious about driving further investment into Australia, then we must ensure we cut red and green bureaucratic processes. Now, Mr Speaker, Premier McGowan, he understands in Western Australia. He agrees. He agrees we should be doing this. There is some resistance from other places, Mr Speaker. There is some resistance from other places. But we must put these projects first and foremost. No one is talking about making things less, making the environment less important, Mr Speaker. This is about a process which costs money, which takes time, which delays projects that can drive jobs and the economy into regional Australia, and that is what we are here for. That is what we stand for. So, Mr Speaker, as the member for Flynn knows, there has been resistance from those opposite, and I would say to them once again, this is a common-sense position. It is a common-sense position. Why should projects have to go through two assessment processes for what is effectively the same? Why should they have to pay for that twice? Why should these projects be delayed for those processes? Mr Speaker, we have projects announced in the north. We have projects announced in the south. We have Adani in central Queensland, which was a 10-year fight, which has finally struck coal, Mr Speaker. Over 2,000 jobs into central Queensland, living in regional areas. That is what we need to deliver for the Australian people, for the Australian economy. This is the thing that is important, Mr Speaker. I say again to those opposite, step up. It's time to do the right thing in terms of this legislation. We need to cut red and green tape. We want our country to be prosperous, and we support the people in the sector who are driving our economy and jobs.
The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to the Deputy Prime Minister's previous answers this week about his capacity to work with women in regional Australia. 2 state National Party leaders, a party trustee, a former chair of the party's Women's Council, the founder of Women in Agriculture and multiple national MPs, all regional women, say he can't be trusted to work with women. Can you confirm that you are replacing your predecessor on the Cabinet Task Force for the Status of Women? And why do so many women in regional Australia who know him say he's not fit for the job?
The Deputy Prime Minister. I'm just going to. Yeah, the Deputy Prime Minister has the.
Look, I thank the honourable member for a question. I don't agree with the assertions. I have, as stated yesterday, every person in their life always tries to be a better person, and I'm no different.
Just before I call the member for Goldstein, if members could cease interjecting, just for the clarity of the House, whilst it hasn't been a regular practice, certainly until recently, for questions to be regularly transferred, I will just flag there's further guidance in practice that does state later on in the chapter on question time that it is in order for more than one minister to answer a particular question without notice in the case of shared responsibility. So that was the point I was trying to find before without detaining the House. The member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's economic recovery plan is working to support Australia's businesses, particularly our mighty manufacturers, to create jobs and grow the economy?
The Minister for Industry.
The member for Goldstein for his question and acknowledge his great support for manufacturing, acknowledge that there are 3,600 people employed in manufacturing in his electorate of Goldstein, and we've discussed with the member some of those manufacturers. One of those great manufacturers is Omega Farm, which is a 100% owned and operated pharmaceutical company, which is, I think, emblematic of the types of great manufacturers we have in this country. They're producing hospital-specific niche pharmaceutical products, so oncology, pain management and dermatology, one of our great Australian manufacturers from the member's electorate. And I'd like to inform the House that today the ABS has produced its detailed labour force figures for the May 2021 quarter, and they of course break down for manufacturing, and they revealed some absolutely exceptional and very, very good news for the manufacturing sector. That good news is that for that May 2021 quarter, that manufacturing employment in Australia has increased by 11,000 people. So total manufacturing employment in Australia has now grown to 908,200 people. So in May 2019, that figure was 898,000 people. So when you look at the May 2019 quarter, so pre-COVID, to the May 2021 quarter, post-COVID, there are now more people employed in manufacturing post-COVID quarter than the pre-COVID quarter in 2019. There is not a country on earth that would not want to be able to say that there are more people employed in manufacturing in the May 2021 post-COVID quarter than the May 2019 pre-COVID quarter. That is a remarkable achievement. And our government is very proud. Our government is very proud of the fact that our great Australian manufacturers, assisted by wonderful policies like JobKeeper, have been able to keep throughout COVID manufacturing, creating and growing jobs and taking advantage of new export opportunities. And we saw just last week, with the announcement of the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement, how important those export manufacturing opportunities are to growing our manufacturing sector. And part of all of this growth has been the Australian government's $1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy across the 6 manufacturing initiatives, other great projects like the $600 million Entrepreneurs Program, which has helped 20,000 businesses innovate and commercialise. And when we look at the way that that project has helped these businesses, of the 20,000 businesses, on average, each of the businesses that have had the Entrepreneurs Program, they have generated an extra $1.5 million extra turnover and each of those businesses have created 4 new jobs, so that we are now in better shape post than pre-COVID.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This week, members of the government in both the Senate and the House moved amendments to a bill which directly contradicts a decision of Cabinet on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Isn't the only way to ensure implementation of the plan is for the Prime Minister to take the water portfolio away from the National Party, and will he do so when he reshuffles his front bench?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't agree with the Leader of the Opposition's characterisation of that issue.
The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker.
Members
my
on
question
my left.
is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. I note the $11.8 billion committed to Australian veterans and their families in this year's budget. Can the Minister update the House on the steps the Morrison government is taking to improve the well-being of the Australian veteran community?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Herbert for his question. I want to note also his record of military service with deployments to both East Timor and Afghanistan. And, Mr Speaker, it is a rare privilege in this place to work in a portfolio that can make such a difference, a portfolio that actually saves people's lives. And I've worked in partnership with my staff, with ex-service organisations and the Department of Veterans Affairs now for the past 3 years, and so we've achieved some great results together. It's also rare, though, I think, Mr Speaker, to work in a portfolio that enjoys such bipartisan support at a federal level. So I think that's because, Mr Speaker, we all respect the men and women who put on the Navy uniform, the Army uniform, the Air Force uniform, and work to keep us safe in challenging times. Mr Speaker, this government is proud of its record of support for the men and women who serve in an ever-changing world. We have seen the very best of our Australian Defence Force in action over the past 2 years at home here in Australia. The work they did during the summer of bushfires, more recently with flooding and with storms, and of course over the past 18 months supporting domestic agencies with the coronavirus response. They truly have been outstanding. They've served with great distinction. But, Mr Speaker, that service does not come without some risk. Risk of injuries, whether it be physical or unseen mental health concerns. And my friend who asked the question, the member for Herbert, knows this very well from his own personal experience. He was actually seriously wounded in Afghanistan in an IED blast. He knows that recovery and transition to civilian life can be a difficult experience for many of our veterans. Now, it's true, most veterans do transition well, although some do demonstrate appalling areas of judgment and become members of Parliament. But I've received plenty of advice, actually, from veterans who are members of Parliament on both sides of the House, and I see the member for Solomon nodding that he has also provided me plenty of advice in this role. But I would say, seriously, Mr Speaker, we do need to remind our veterans community and remind the Australian community more broadly that our veterans do become great citizens. They make an enormous contribution to our nation beyond their military life. And for those who do need some form of support, it's important that we let them know that help is available, and please don't suffer in silence. Please reach out to organisations like Open Arms on 1800 011 046. We are continually working across this parliament to improve the system of veteran support, and this year's budget included $11.8 billion to support an estimated 325,000 veterans and their families. Now, Mr Speaker, I would like to make one final point to our veterans and their families. Despite the shenanigans you sometimes see in this place, this chamber respects your service. It understands the freedoms we exercise in this place every day were secured through your enormous sacrifice throughout many generations. And we also recognise the eternal vigilance of today's service men and women, and for that we offer you a very simple thank you for your service. And I thank you.
And the Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Just very quickly, I join with the Minister for Veterans Affairs in paying tribute to all those brave men and women who serve us in uniform, pay tribute to the sacrifice that they make, including members of this chamber have made in the past, and commit, along with every member of this parliament, to ensure that we do better in looking after them when they return home.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water. When did the minister first become aware of the National Party's plot to shred the Murray-Darling Basin Plan?
The Minister for Water.
Well, can I thank the Shadow Minister for a question, Mr Speaker? Well, the National Party's always been aware of what's going on when it comes to water, Mr Speaker. Always. They always stand up for their regional constituents, and that is no surprise. Not to me or anyone behind me or anyone they represent. So, Mr Speaker, we continue to deliver when it comes to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We have already delivered 2,029 gigalitres of gap-bridging water. That is a phenomenal result, Mr Speaker. $270 million in the Murray-Darling Communities Investment Package that will go towards those regional communities that are heavily impacted by things like buybacks. We have been absolutely committed, Mr Speaker, to ruling out further buybacks. There will be no more buybacks while this government is in place, Mr Speaker, because it is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. We have shifted over $1.3 billion to all farm efficiency projects. That is expected to recover up to 150 gigalitres of water. That is the right thing to do. We are striking the right balance between communities, between irrigators, between business and between the environment, and we will continue to do that.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on Brisbane's bid to host the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games and how the Morrison government has supported that campaign? Will the Prime Minister outline the benefits that would flow to Australia, particularly Queensland, should we secure this major global event?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his strong involvement as my representative in working together with the Queensland Government, along with the Minister for Sport, to support the Brisbane 2032 bid. On the 23rd of July, before we gather again as a parliament, the Olympic Games will get underway in Tokyo. And I want to start by commending the Japanese government, particularly Prime Minister Suga and the organising committee for their great tenacity and determination in pressing ahead with these games that had to be delayed a year, Mr Speaker. I can only imagine the disappointment of last year, and for them to bounce back and to be able to go forward with these games is a great credit to the people of Japan and the government of Japan under Prime Minister Suga's leadership. Mr Speaker, we'll be working hard in these final stages because as that Games comes together, the IOC members will take a final decision on Brisbane's bid to host the 2032 Games. I was delighted to speak again to the IOC President, Dr Buck, just last week, again ahead of that final vote for IOC members, and will continue to participate as we lead up to that final vote. We have backed this bid every step of the way, Mr Speaker, working first with the regional councils in South East Queensland who promoted this, Mr Speaker, working with the Queensland Government and convincing that this was a good project for us all to get on board with, and we have, committing $10 million. And as part of that last set of bid documents put forward, came to an agreement with the Queensland Government with a 50-50 split on games-related infrastructure based on a 50-50 governance model. So a genuine partnership in the equivalent of what the Olympic Coordination Authority was for the Sydney Games of 2000. KPMG has estimated the economic and social benefits of the Games to be $8.1 billion for Queensland and $17.6 billion, Mr Speaker, for Australia. It's projected to create some 120,000 jobs for Australia, including 90,000 jobs for Queensland. So, Mr Speaker, this is a great opportunity, not just for South East Queensland, not just for Brisbane. We'll be one of, I believe, only 2 countries, if we're successful, to have 3 Olympic cities if Brisbane is indeed chosen for the 2032 Games. That says a lot about our passion for the Olympic movement and also our passion for sport as a country. And as our athletes gather and they make their way to Tokyo, where many of them are already, Mr Speaker, we wish them our very, very best. We'll be cheering them on. They have laboured, they have trained, they have gone through this past year of uncertainty as they wondered whether their great life's opportunity of competing in Olympic Games Games in the Australian colours would come true. We could not be more proud of them. We know they will do us proud, Mr Speaker. We thank all the coaches, the families, all those who have supported their road to Tokyo, Mr Speaker, and we know it will be a glorious one. And we wish everyone at the Games all the best, particularly the people of Japan.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I join with the government in wishing all of our athletes all the best in Tokyo. It's been a particularly tough time for people in the sporting communities with the uncertainty that's been created due to COVID, as well as the uncertainty that's been created particularly on international events. And I wish the Japanese government certainly all the best as well in hosting the Games, and we look forward to watching on our screens, because my understanding is there won't be any Australian tourists for the first time at any Olympic Games present there due to health concerns, which are perfectly understandable. But all our athletes, Australia is with you as always.
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I concur with the remarks of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and ask that further questions for today be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Deputy